something that as a graduate of seminary can be very hard to explain to an average layperson who has not had a graduate level education in theology is that doing theology is a very different task than just explaining Bible verses. I will make a theological statement like any theology that depends on someone's death is wrong. And people inevitably will come back at me with Bible verses. What about this Bible verse that seems to require someone's death? Doesn't that disprove the theological point that you're making, Anthony? And there are a variety of disciplines within the study of Scripture that are all related to the Bible, but are doing different things. So there's systematic theology, which in the Western world is what we are most familiar with. Systematic theology creates a system like Calvinism, Arminianism, and based off of the tenets of that system, imposes itself onto the text and makes sense of the text in order to support that system. Now, the creators of a systematic theology would say that they are gleaning information, theological ideas from Scripture in order to create that system. But then, once that system is concocted, that then has a responsibility to fit all of the biblical data within that system to make it neat and tidy. And an honest theologian, even an honest systematic theologian, will confess that there is no theological system that can make sense of every piece of biblical data. Now, I think there are maybe some dishonest ones or some, inerrantist types of theology that, particularly within Calvinism, really stringent forms of Reformed theology would say there are no pieces of biblical data that disagree with Calvinism because Calvinism is the one true system. Most theologians aren't going to say that. They are willing to admit there's a Calvinistic system. We believe that that's what best explains Scripture. And then there's going to be pieces here and there that don't quite fit in. Same thing could be true of like universalism or infernalism, eternal conscious torment. A universalist will say, I'm a universalist. I believe that the general sort of grain of Scripture is going towards universalism. And then, there are going to be texts that are hard to explain. Same thing is true of infernalism, eternal conscious torment theology, that they would say the general grain or trajectory of Scripture is towards infernalism, and then you have a couple universalistic sounding texts that we're going to fit into this pre-existing system. Biblical theology is in contrast to systematic theology. Biblical theology is trying to read with the grain of Scripture and use the structures within Scripture in order to build a theological system. Biblical theologians are a lot more comfortable than systematic theologians admitting that the editors of the Tanakh are going to have different assumptions than the editors of the New Testament. And even though they're going to argue for some sort of coherence between the Old and New Testaments, the editors or redactors or people who put the canon together were not conscious of those allegiances between the two. And then there's just the practice of exegesis, of the actually exegeting, explaining the text of verses, chapters, chunks of Scripture. And you can derive theology from exegesis, but it is a slightly different discipline. And so within the academy, you can have people with all working around the Bible with wildly different careers and ways that they spend their time. Are they in the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic? They're doing sort of scriptural New Testament or Old Testament exegetical study. Are they building theological systems that are sort of pre-existent, such as Calvinism or Arminianism or Catholic theology or Orthodox theology? They're probably systematic theologians. Are they doing biblical theology, folks like N.T. Wright, that they are deriving a theology out of the text that doesn't necessarily fit into a pre-existing system? I think American Christianity and often the world has been deeply influenced by the sort of diversification of Scripture, that every verse sort of is a universe unto itself and can answer questions, which I don't think does us a lot of good favors. And this idea of proof texting, that here's a theological idea, but I can dislodge it with one verse, that's not great. And I think we've been done a disservice by sort of an obsession brought to us by Reformed theology with systematic theology, that everything must fit neat and tidy in a system, even though the biblical authors were not thinking of Calvinism. They were not creating a Calvinistic system when they were writing. And if you are willing to accept that the Bible has many voices and many different theological ideas in it, and also agree with the idea that it has a trajectory, that it's pointing towards system, that it has a redemptive movement hermeneutic, that it's moving towards some general big idea that maybe not any individual author was conscious of, but maybe later editors or redactors were, maybe not. Anyway, if you're willing to accept some of that, then you can do theology, do biblical theology, and come up with some conclusions, which is different than just doing exegesis to say this author meant this, and this author meant this, and this author meant this, and never the two shall meet. Anyway, I've talked for like 6 minutes, and I still don't feel like I've been very clear, because this is hard stuff to sort of boil down, even into a very long TikTok or very long Instagram story, because this is the work that's been going on for centuries in the academy, in the university, in the seminary, and hasn't always sort of percolated to what's going on in the pew. Some of that's fine. People in the pew don't necessarily care. And some of it's not fine because we are hiding the complexity of biblical studies and theology from folks who might really benefit from it.